Hey folks, Steve here with a very special Axis Empires Ultimate Edition video for you today. This is going to be, we'll do the introduction, maybe even a part zero, however you want to refer to this, of the Dai Senso half of the game. And in particular, we're looking at the Tora training scenario, which is a four-turn scenario that is the only training scenario in this version of the game. In previous versions, well, I guess the only previous version of Dai Senso, there were a couple other training scenarios that were really small in scope, and I do think you could probably like set them up on this map. I'm pretty sure it's like the hex numbers might be different, so you might get in trouble there. But if you go like look up the old rulebook, you could probably set those up. But they cover a lot of the ground that we've already covered in the Krieg training scenarios, so it makes sense, I guess, since you can't buy Dai Senso separately, and back then it was a totally separate game product. You're I think in Ultimate Edition expected to learn the Krieg side first, maybe a little bit, and you're going to learn all the ground combat support marker stuff before you come in a Dai Senso, which is how I'm doing it. So that's all working out. But this is a very kind of different situation, obviously, being the Pacific Theater, Asia and Pacific theaters, I should say. And um, this scenario, for being a trading scenario, uses the whole map. It's a full map deal. There's really not much in the way of like single map scenarios in Dai Senso. You're really, at least in this edition, you're kind of locked into playing with um, both the Asia map and the Pacific map. And there's a lot going on, as you can imagine. The scenario starts in oh no, I'm sorry, November, December 1941, which I wonder what happens then, right? An infamous day. And runs through to the end of April, May. Now, the thing that I had to come to some understanding is just there's a lot of minor countries or potential minor countries in this half of Axis Empires Ultimate Edition. So I really had to kind of go through and understand, like, okay, Sigyang is, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. It's a minor country. Kansu is a minor country. Szechuan is considered a minor country within China, and so you just have a lot of different minor country units. In addition to, here's Japan, here's the British, here's the Americans and the Soviets. So, the sheer number of counters in this game is a little bit different, and I did separate the Japanese forces out into their like card reinforcement number baggies. Everybody else is kind of in a weird mishmash to try to organize counters, a little bit different, but still generally easy to set up. So just kind of round things up. We have the edge of the map kind of just goes to India there with some garrisons in some of the more important locations of India. Um, we have Burma there with some Commonwealth garrisoning. We have Malaya and Singapore. I will call out, I've got some blue bingo chits out there. I'll talk about them in a second. And then we've just got a smattering elsewhere of uh, units in China. The Japanese fighting the Chinese in this game, which this is one of the things that this game gets, Dai Senso specifically, but just part of the Axis Empires package, gets some love from gamers is that it really tries to represent like the situation in China a bit differently, closer to what it was. Um, and I'll talk. So let's talk about that for a second. In probably most other World War II games, I mean, you think about like, okay, let's talk about Axis and Allies for a second. The Chinese are like American green units on that map. There's China's not given much detail at all. In World in Flames, you have a distinction between a nationalist and Chinese, and in the context of that game, without any of the like days of decision stuff. Right, I'm just going to leave that out. For World in Flames, it's generally like, yeah, there is China, and there's a player who controls China, and they're tending to control both the Chinese and the nationalists. If you're playing Days of Decision, okay, you might split that up a little bit between the Chinese and the nationalist Chinese. You'll have these warlord units that kind of represent these um, not quite integrated forces, but they still operate kind of together. But there are some command restrictions on that. So at least in World in Flames, like China is at least split into kind of two parts with some fringe elements, but the fringe elements don't feel very um, well illustrated, we'll say. And that's always one thing of like, okay, well they decided to stop at the Chinese and nationalist split, and that's fine. I want to say A World at War does something similar. I'm trying to recall. One game that does this really interestingly is Cataclysm, and I quite like the way that Cataclysm does it because it it also breaks out China into what is a mixture of like neutral independent forces. They're not acting as a integrated whole necessarily. Um, so I quite like the way that Cataclysm does it for that game's level of abstraction. Um, and then I think in the forthcoming Lightning Strikes game from Compass, which is a World in Flames relative, that game design actually does go to the effort to trying to split up China into both. There's a nationalist force, I think, a Chinese force, and then they represent, the quote unquote warlords in very specific, like, autonomous entities, which is good. So I'm talking about a lot of other games. How does this game do? Well, China is broken up into different provinces or minor countries, I guess is really the term for the game. So we have Yunnan, we have Jiangsu, we have Sichuan, we have Hebei, we have Kansu, and each of those has its own force pool of units. So I don't want to mess with my camera stand too much, but like the Sichuan units are these yellow with blueprint. The nationalists, um, Kiangsu, are the sort of blue with purple print. Hopei's purple. Yunnan is white with this yellow print. Kind of hard to see sometimes, but it's not too bad. Uh, so there's a great variability here, but they're all part of China. So there's sort of this like, yes, they are distinct minor countries, but they can kind of operate together, but they have their own distinct force pool. So if you exhaust um, their force pool on the map, you can only rebuild in that minor country, I think, with those units. So Japan has, maybe there's an incentive there to like focus on one province at a time and try to knock it out and try to weaken the other ones. I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to be really careful with the minor country rules around China and make sure that I play that correct the whole way through. Now, this short scenario, there might not be a lot of room for mistakes, or like I won't have very many opportunities to make mistakes, but that's possible. And then zooming back out for a second, as I look at the rest of the map, and a lot of Australia is not getting used directly, so that's where I'm going to put my dice tray. But there are forces here down here in the South Pacific. Um, some garrisons in Australia. Weirdly, there's nothing in Sydney. I don't know if there's supposed to be, but there wasn't anything in the setup. Um, Even in New Zealand, we've got some defenses. The Americans have strewn about the map very loosely detachments. And keeping in mind, like detachments are barely more than a control markers, effectively. They do make their locations open ports for uh, operations, but Honolulu has an actual like one attack, one defense, one movement unit off in Glareland. Uh, we've got some stuff up in Dutch Harbor, and then similarly, the Japanese out in the Pacific itself have a mixture. In some places, they have just detachments. In some places, they have greater strength, like in the Marshall Islands here. There's a fortress at Truk. There's forces in Palau and stuff near Guam that's going to probably walk into there when the hostilities start. And you can already kind of tell just by looking through things that the um, the articulation of the units is going to be very different. So we're dealing with islands. Islands are currently held by detachments. As we start getting into the sort of like Pacific side of the war, I think it's going to entail a lot of like, hey, we're either going to use our support markers or we're going to use uh, special naval landing force SNLF markers from the Japanese to capture some of these islands in a very swift manner, one that doesn't require a lot of logistical overhead in terms of game rules. Just hey, can we trace properly to that location? Can we get a support marker down? If so, we're going to probably effectively replace um, some detachment markers with Japanese detachment markers. And that's kind of it. Like that will be a very quickly addressed island invasion in the early phases of the game. Um, so we'll see how that feels. And this scenario does not have a Schiffskrieg setup. Other scenarios do, and I will tell you that I am reading the Schiffskrieg rules and I am processing them in my brain, and I will very likely try to get that out on the table. But not for this training scenario. I think this is a good one for turns, but uses the whole map for me to get a sense of the way that the Dai Senso side of this is going to work. Okay, so what are we going to be trying to do? Well, as soon as the game really starts, the Japanese are going to play their East Wind Rain card, which, just by the by, is the attack America and everything card. Um, so strike south, plan for war is adopted. East Wind Rain. We lose North Wind Cloudy. We're going to go ba 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 ba. Surprise attack table. Total War is now in effect, so this is going to trigger Total War. And we get some other stuff in our force pool, and we get some replacement steps. So this is the real big kickoff card. There's already some stuff in the setup that's been prepared for the entering of Total War, but it's going to be, well, I guess it'll be pretty straightforward for that purpose. So things will activate, like we are going to get certain cards, or not cards, units in force pools. The Americans and the British are going to have a conditional event activate, which is effectively, how do they refer to it? The U.S. and the British Far Eastern forces, and a lot of that stuff is already in the delay box because the game is nice to you and doesn't make you have to go fish it out, later, just as part of setup. That stuff's in the delay box up there, along with some other Japanese things that they'll be looking to leverage. Interestingly, there's a lot of stuff in the strategic warfare box. We have an allied collapse marker already. I'm not exactly sure what that. Maybe that represents the early conflict between Japan and Russia, or maybe that's representing something from China. Not sure. Minor production for Japanese Axis forces. We have the marker for France defeated. I'll have to double check what that means. There's a Allied minor production, and then which we'll probably be using for China, and then there's an oil embargo marker, and the Japanese are going to want to get rid of that. One, because this increases the Axis delay marker, DRM, which is no good. And then the other thing that it does is that, and this represents like the Japanese not having access to oil, which forces us to go into the Dutch East Indies, right? Is there are certain cards on the Japanese, or in the Japanese deck of cards, that I believe require the oil embargo to not be in place. So I think some of our cards, like if we want access to some of our good cards, we're going to have to go get that oil, which we're certainly going to do that. I'm going to want to make sure to do that in a campaign game. In this game, I'm not sure it matters because our cards are pre-selected for us. Um, but certainly in a campaign game, I'd be like, yes, let's grab some oil because we want to use those other cards down the road, and they require the oil embargo to not be in place. So when we get control of, say, this part of Borneo, uh, Palembang, Surabaya, then I believe we get rid of the oil embargo marker. We remove it from the strategic warfare box. It's one of those like it. You got to really go look at. You really got to go look at these markers lookup rules and be like, okay, what is going on with this? What does this mean? It's in play, so that means its effect is being felt on the board. So what is that effect? I've got to go double check all those things. But yes, that's how it's going to start. Um, I guess I should just talk, since I'm talking about the cards, talk about uh, both cards for the Japanese. I have a hard time picking these up off my plexiglass. So we're gonna have, come on, Eastwind Rain, then followed up by Victory Disease, and it's just gonna ultimately lead to some die rolling that may affect the overall situation. So that's what the Japanese are gonna have for this scenario. The Allies have Pacific Mobilization, and there's a little bit of errata on this card that is meant to be a 231, or one of these numbers for this multinational unit is incorrect. You can check the errata for that minor stuff. So Pacific Mobilization, we're going to get some stuff, reinforcements and replacements for the Allies, which is good. And then we will be doing the Doolittle raid, which is, you can read all the fun verbiage down there, and that's a conditional, or that's a particular event that will apply, and we'll also look at rolling on the die to determine kind of response. So not a lot of games even kind of bring up or know how to bring up the Doolittle raid. So interesting that this game does at least like say, hey, well, this is happening. It's a thing that's happening. The effect should probably, I haven't read what the event does, but it should have some event on or some impact on like either the Japanese impetus to need to attack or regain honor or something, or what real effect you want to have there. May not apply as well in a game without Schiff's Krieg, but we'll see. I think I saw a Schiff's Krieg notation on there, so it could be we don't even use the Doolittle raid event in a non-Schiff's Krieg game. But I'm not going to grab the card. It's going to keep going. Yeah. So what are the blue markers out there for? Well, I put my handy dandy bingo chit markers on the hexes that matter for victory in this 4-turn scenario. So this kind of drives the like, okay, well, maybe in a campaign game I'd be operating a little bit differently, but for this I'm going to need to focus effort and think through where I want to go and how I'm going to get there. So I need to control, I think it's 2 of 4. Yeah, we need to have our axis tide marker in the 2 victory point space. Right now it's in the 1. Um, but we're going to need to get at least 2 of this city in China, Kuilin. So, kind of requiring effort in China. Or Singapore, which, we're going to want to grab Singapore. Sure. Port Moresby down here. And then the last one is Wake Island, which is out here. Now, I just look at like what's the least defended right now. I'd say, hey, Wake Island's a good pickup. I'd probably want to try for Port Moresby, but we know how that didn't really fully take place in history. But Singapore, I don't know how about the China one. That one might be a tough nut to crack because there's a lot of strength in the Yunnan province or Yunnan minor country right now with the Chinese. So that might be a hard one to do, but we can certainly try. But I definitely see it being more advantageous to try to pick up these specific holdings because, hey, we're going to be at war with the British and the Americans anyway. Yeah. Now, for the Americans and the British, the Soviets are not in this scenario at all. They ordinarily would be in their own sort of minor way. I don't know that they're going to have a lot that they can do to start with. So I think this is one of those things, like this is a training scenario, but it truly, I think, is going to be the Japanese kind of deciding what's happening, and the allied player at most just trying to figure out where can they use their response forces to inhibit the Pacific Blitz, I guess. So um, the interesting thing is, because this is only covering the initial short blitz, early bits. It's why, like, we might not even try to get into the Philippines um, in the 4 turns. I mean, maybe we will. I don't know. The victory conditions incentivize us to go in a certain direction, but less important than we get in the Philippines, because that, I think, would have been happening later. I have to go look it up. But yeah, so our initial bits, let's grab some Pacific holdings. Let's start making some progress against the British in Singapore, and that might just be the best. That might be enough for us to accomplish the things that we need to accomplish. Um, yeah. So what else? Um, Maybe not a whole lot else. I think we're in a pretty good spot. I will point out, because folks may notice this and ask the question. This scenario is purposefully, like, not including some stuff. So we talked about the Soviets not being included. You'll notice there's no units in Manchukuo up there up north, except for like one unit that's on the border that will get moved to the China front very soon. The scenario is just saying, like, hey, we're not including any of the Kwangtung uh, Manchukuo oriented forces, and we're not asking you to worry about garrisoning Manchukuo. We're just leaving that entirely out, which I guess makes sense, because Manchukuo is generally a, like, you're going to worry about losing Manchukuo to the Soviets at some point is kind of the strategic concern there. So if you're not including the Soviets, yeah, it doesn't make sense to include the Manchukuo Kwangtung stuff. So we're just kind of, this is truly an Axis versus Western powers training scenario, and we'll see what happens. It makes me wonder why they didn't just leave India out, because I don't necessarily expect the Axis to be pushing into India, but I don't know. We'll see what's going on. We only have 4 turns. Um, so my thoughts from here are going to be, well, just how exactly is the support marker game going to play out? Because that's really now the big piece. Well, and this might be hard to see because of the red counters. So if I just look very quickly at my marker stuff, the Japanese start with 2 air, 3 surface fleets, carrier fleet, and a bunch of convoys, both a regular convoy and 3 scratch convoys. They got their beachhead marker. They've got some infantry and stuff up above, but it's nothing too crazy. What I would point out is that there are only 6 units left with detachments on the back of them. And so you think about that, like, well, that means the Japanese can effectively place 6 more detachments before they run out of coverage, basically. And anywhere else that we're going to hold is going to have to be held with a real unit. Now, the thing I don't quite get, and maybe somebody can help me understand, um, like the calculus on the detachments. I guess it's like you can place a detachment so long as you have one in your force pool for free, basically, when you leave a hex behind, right? You say, hey, I took control of this hex, I'm going to leave it, but I'm going to leave a detachment. It doesn't really cost me anything in terms of direct at point value. Like, at that point in time, you're not spending anything. But placing that detachment means you have a 011 unit that can't come onto the board, and that's kind of interesting, because then it's like, well, couldn't I hold the same hex with a 011 unit? And you can. It's just that you have to spend your replacement point to build it, and then operations or time spent transporting it um, to the hex of concern. So I think that's the balance of it. Every detachment marker in the game is on the back of, like, a real unit that could be used for combat purposes, but it's that placement for effectively free, but giving up that potential unit to be built and used. So If folks have thoughts on kind of the knife's edge on that, I'd be interested to hear it. Here's the Western. So we have some British, we have Americans, we have Chinese forces, and at the start here, you're going to notice the support marker imbalance here. There's one British surface fleet. There's American CV fleet, Task Force 11, one surface fleet for the Americans with their beachhead marker. So you think about that, say, well, what if you went somewhere where, if you attacked some place that did not have a British naval base nearby, you could basically, like, the Japanese can count on outnumbering, very likely, a single surface fleet and a single CV fleet um, of the Japanese. So, or I'm sorry, the Japanese can overwhelm a single part of the Allied forces here, depending on geographically where their naval basing is. So, if you were, trying to make a big play somewhere to place an invasion on, say, Wake Island, the Americans, on by their lonesome, are not going to be able to contest the Japanese. The Japanese right now have enough that they can kind of win the support marker battle as needed. Same goes for if they attack just the British. It's even easier right now. Now that may mean if the Japanese have to go hardcore against it, they have to use up a lot of their markers. They're not going to be able to do as much for a while. But the delay marker stuff at the beginning of Total War will be relatively balanced, all things considered. And so um, I guess that's kind of that's where we're stuck. We've got to think about um, how to defend against the Japanese, who right now have a superiority of markers. That superiority will change, but it might not change in time for the 4-turn scenario. Now, again, this is just a part zero introduction kind of thing. Just me coming to grips with what's out there. There's already some supply convoys out there and deployed. There's a lot of things that are just set up, ready to go. But there will be the good question of, like, how do we want to do this? How do we want to do this uh, for real? What can we do? What are the obvious things to do? Those are going to be unclear, just as they were kind of unclear in Totaler Krieg of, like, okay, I'm using this game system that's still pretty new. What are these obvious things to do? If I were playing, a game I'm used to, like World of Flames, I'd be thinking a lot about, like, okay, I've got to get my Marine Corps or Marine divisions. I've got to get my ships that are going to transport them. I need to think about from which port am I going to execute the landing from, and where in the Pacific will surprise me that the notional defenders are 0 and I just take the hex. Here, this is kind of, it's all kind of smushed together to maybe an easier process to execute, but it's a different process to execute and think, big scale on, like, what's going to get me the most bang for my buck for the 4 turns. What can I take that will then be very difficult for the allies to take back in those turns. And keeping in mind the other thing I didn't talk about, I should talk about before we wrap up. Weather in this map is a bigger doozy than it is in Europe, where you can kind of count on, like, most of the map being one weather type, and then you've got the desert, and then you've got the Arctic, but, like, the north or the temperate zone is a lot of the map, and so you know it's mud, it's snow, and you just operate. Here, different chunks of the map are in very different weather areas. So there's the north, which is basically Manchukuo, Japan proper, Russia. That's the north. There's a desert area which encompasses Australia, some of China, and Mongolia. There's a central zone, which is um, basically the rest of China. I guess that's the easiest way to say it. And then there's a north monsoon zone, which is India and basically Southeast Asia, and the south monsoon zone, which is the Netherlands, East Indies, and Papua. Uh, so Papua New Guinea. So the we have to be very careful to like look at the map and make sure we know like where is there supposed to be weather. And as it happens right now on this first turn of the scenario, in the north it is snowing. Now, granted, there's really not many units in the north, so not much we have to worry about. But the south monsoon, which is the again a good chunk, basically Borneo, the Dutch East Indies, Netherlands East Indies, that whole area is experiencing mud, and so we're going to need to think about and go, well, okay, well there, I might want to be jumping and grabbing some oil, but it is mud, and I may not want to deal with the mud problem necessarily if it's going to mean a whole bunch of pain for the Japanese. Not sure. I don't think that the Netherlands East Indies force pool is very big. I think it's quite small. So it might not be a big deal to try to jump in there and grab some oil, or maybe get into Brunei and get oil there. We've got several different options to try to pursue here. I do think jumping immediately on some of these victory hexes would be ideal for us. That would be very good. So whether I'm going to have to just be very careful of every turn, look and see the different spread of weather conditions, and they are going to be varied, and I am going to have to like look at the specific hexes and make sure I'm like, okay, is this mud or not? Is this snow or not? What's the deal? Um, okay, so with that, I think we can wrap up this video just talking through things. Generally the rules are basically the same. Where the core rule book applies here, there are specific red text nuances which I'll need to watch out for. I've tried to review those. Um, but we'll try to play through this as best we can across one or two videos for the 4 turns. After this, when I complete this training scenario, we'll probably start looking at a full-fledged but shorter campaign like Divine Wind, which starts in 1944, and maybe then I'll mix in Schiffskrieg, and we'll get a feel for Schiffskrieg. That'll probably be a pretty good scenario to try those rules out, but who knows? So anyway, in the next video, we will start the Axis turn proper. We'll play East Wind Rain. We will enter Total War, and we will see the big activities play out. So with that, thanks for watching. Hope you're excited for the next stage of my Axis Empires coverage. We've still got a lot that we're going to show over time here, folks. I'm going to be in Axis Empires land for a little while yet, but I hope you enjoy the ride along with me as we go through. We will see you in the next one. Take care. Keep on gaming.